So, one of the things that I can remember about being a little bit younger than I am is that when you're a kid, when you're little, parents are always telling you to clean your room. And as much as you might not want to, eventually your mom and dad, or if you live with them, your grandma or grandpa, will eventually convince you to clean your room. You know, whether it be by some logic or a belt, but you'll clean your room. But sometimes if you're going around picking up things, pulling stuff out from under your bed, vacuuming and dusting all over the place, there might actually be that moment where you think to yourself, but what if I didn't clean my room? What would happen? Would it really be all that bad? Would the world actually end if I didn't clean my room? A few years ago, a friend of mine told me about how when she was little, she did just that. Eventually, she got to the point where she just got tired of cleaning her room, so she stopped doing it. And when she told me about how she made this decision, what was interesting was how simple it was. She just stopped cleaning her room, and that was it. You know, if she had trash, she would just kind of leave it on the floor. She'd toss it and just leave it where it was. If she had dirty clothes, she'd just toss them on the floor and just kind of leave them where they were. But eventually, as this kept going on, you would see one pile here, another pile here, another here, and another here. And if she was hungry for a snack, she'd go get some food and bring it back to her room and enjoy her snack. You know, she might sit on the bed and eat, or sit in a chair and eat. But eventually, again, once she was done, she would just kind of set the food down wherever she wanted to. You know, if she finished her apple, just kind of toss it. And so over time, what you saw was that you'd have these little piles. They kept growing and growing and growing. And it seemed like they kind of spawned other piles, and then eventually those piles would keep growing and growing and growing. And eventually these piles would kind of merge with each other to create these, you know, uniquely shaped islands. Like a little junk snowflake, each being unique in its own right. But eventually, as she talked to me, as she explained this part of her childhood, she said that eventually things got so bad to the point where she had this goal of just maintaining little paths to all the important places in her room. You know, a path to her bed, a path to her closet, then a path so that she could leave this room. And that lasted for some time, but eventually things got so bad that her parents stepped in. As she talked to me, she said that her parents actually took a rake and pushed all of her stuff into the hallway and told her that if there was anything in this pile of stuff that she really wanted, she could sort through it and put all the things that she really wanted that meant something to her back in her room. Otherwise, she could sort through it and toss the things that were trash. And if there were some things that she kind of got tired of, well, then she could donate to somebody who could get a little bit more use out of them. Because by this time, these piles of clothes and trash and junk and even food had probably even drawn in some bugs and some spiders. And mice, unconfirmed, but maybe mice. But through this process of going through all the stuff in her room and deciding what to keep, what to toss, and what to give away, she told me that order was eventually restored to her room, and there was kind of a happy ending. Now, I do realize that this is a kind of extreme situation. This isn't necessarily typical. But at the same time, I also expect that there are a good number of us who have had to do the work of going through all of our junk Whether it be cleaning our room or cleaning out a garage, and deciding what's worth keeping and what's worth getting rid of. Either by tossing it into the trash or donating it to somebody who could use it. Somebody who might really appreciate it. And this action is sorting through and deciding what we want to keep and what we want to kind of toss out and let go of. This is the kind of thing that I really want us to focus on this morning in the passage that we have from Ephesians. Because when we read through the passage that we have today, what happens is that we hear Paul trying to tell us about how, as followers of Christ, we have to do some sorting in our own lives. And even though cleaning our rooms is not necessarily a big part of Christian discipleship, us disciples of Christ are called to sort through the different behaviors and mindsets and actions of ours that we have carried with us, in some cases, for years or for decades. We're called to sort through these things. And when we come to a way of thinking that really does not belong in the life of a Christian, and when we come to a way of thinking or a way of acting that we need to get rid of, Paul says that we need to put away or put off that kind of thing. And actually, when you look at how Paul talks about what we should be doing with all these different things that don't belong in our lives, it's kind of like he's talking about an old t-shirt. T-shirts that at some point in our lives we look down and realize that it's at least 2 or 3 sizes too small. Now, at this point in our lives, it's actually inappropriate for us to be wearing a shirt that is so tiny. And so it's like there's this need for us to take it off and get a shirt that's more appropriate and fits us a little bit better. And so there's the action of putting off and putting on. And while we can usually give away the old shirts that don't necessarily fit us anymore, when you listen to how Paul talks about these different things that us as Christians need to put off, you don't get the impression that it would be good to take these things that we put off that are inappropriate for our lives as Christians and to give them to another person. Instead, when we take these things off, we just need to be done with it and toss it. And so when we read Paul's letter to this group of Christians in the city of Ephesus, we see that he tells us about how, just like we need to clean our rooms or clean out a garage, we also need to take a good hard look at our own lives and sort through some stuff of ours in order to decide whether or not we should be keeping those things around or whether or not those are some things that we need to toss out. Now, that sounds easy enough, but there's that question. How do you decide whether or not something's worthy to keep, or how do you decide whether or not something's needing to be tossed? As Christians, we can actually tell whether or not we need to keep or toss something by comparing what we have in our lives to the kind of lives that Jesus taught us to live, the kind of living that we see embodied throughout Jesus' ministry. Which, while this might seem a little obvious to most church people, the idea of somebody looking to follow Christ, the idea that somebody looking to follow Christ can learn what they need to keep and what they need to toss, how to live their lives by actually looking at how Jesus lived his life, is actually a very powerful idea. Because when you think about it, as people living in the United States, our culture is already trying to teach us what's appropriate to keep and what we need to toss away. And in some cases, this way of seeing the world around us and even seeing our own actions actually runs very contrary to what we learned through Jesus and the way that we see Jesus living. I'll give you some examples. For example, in American culture, we're taught that if you want to, you can hate somebody. If someone does something to you, if someone steals something from you, then you can hate them as long as you want. That's what our culture teaches us. Someone steals something from us and we never get it back. And as far as you know, that person is never punished for their wrongdoings. Our culture teaches us that we almost have the right to hate that person as much and as hard as we want to. Or if somebody runs around spreading lies about us and ruins the reputation that we tried to build up amongst our friends or in our workplace, again, our culture teaches us that we can hate that person, that we really don't have to forgive them at all. On the other hand, when you read through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, these Gospels, and see how Jesus deals with people who hurt him, and who manipulate them, and who spread lies about him, you don't see somebody who responds to stuff like that with hate. Instead, you see that when somebody tries to wrong Christ, and Christ does get wronged real hard, he answers those attacks with love. So, by loving people, Christ shows us that hatred is something that we need to get rid of. That's one of those things that we need to toss off. And here's another example. As Americans, we're also taught that if you have something, it's because you've worked hard for it. And so we have this fantasy, this kind of Marlboro Man cowboy fantasy, that the hard-working man, who even though he starts at the bottom, through hard work and determination, we're taught that he can always pick himself, and I'm using he very purposefully, that he can always pick himself up by his own bootstraps and get rich through his own sweat and his own work. And so, in our country, we have this nice, if you had a nice, comfortable life, we're taught that it's because you worked hard for it. And since there's nothing stopping other people from working as hard as you have, then there's really no excuse for them not to have as much as you do. And so there's no reason at all that you should feel sorry for people who have less than you do. On the other hand, when you read through the Gospels, you see these wonderful moments where Jesus rushes to the aid of people who have been victims of this sort of cold-hearted bootstrap mentality. People who have found themselves on the business end of this kind of thinking. But notice how whenever Jesus comes to help one of these people, these forgotten individuals, he never stops to ask, why exactly is it that you are so poor? What did you do to get so poor? Jesus never asks questions like that. He never asks, well, how do I know that I'm not just wasting my time trying to help someone like you? Jesus never wonders whether or not it's a wise investment to help somebody or to serve somebody. Instead of these moments of service to others, Jesus does not just dismiss other people who might have lost everything, or have never had anything to start with, or who, as hard as they worked, just never seemed to put anything together, much wealth at all. He never dismisses these people as kind of lazy good-for-nothings. Instead, he helps these struggling people. And whenever you see how Jesus teaches his disciples and the things that he teaches them and how he teaches them to live, again you hear this message that if you're going to follow Christ, you serve these people whenever you see them. And you give them whatever it is that they need. And if you're thinking, well, I can get taken advantage of in that kind of situation, you can. And Jesus did get taken advantage of. But that doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. It just kind of goes with the territory. And in the passage that we have from Ephesians today, Paul reiterates this aspect of Jesus' ministry when he mentions how people should labor and work honestly with their own hands. Not in order to amass this kind of mountain of wealth, but Paul says that people should do this in order that they might have something that they could go out and share with the needy. In other words, it's people looking to throw off our old worldly ways. Ways of thinking about the world around us that might not necessarily have anything to do with what Jesus teaches his disciples. Paul encourages us to work hard so that we might be able to give whatever resources that we manage to cobble together to somebody who's been kicked to the curb and just kind of left to fend for themselves. That there's a calling for us to care for these people. And so by caring for these forgotten parts of society, Christ shows us that this dismissive kind of attitude toward people who might not have as much as we do is also something that we need to toss off, that we need to get rid of. It might not seem like it, but it's one of those things that we need to put off. But these are just a few examples of how we can use Jesus' actions and his teachings to guide us as we try to decide what things in our lives are okay to keep and what needs to be thrown out, or as Paul puts it, be put off. And as weird as this might sound, this kind of self-examination is what we're called to do on a daily basis as Christians. Because as we continue or even start to follow Christ, this kind of self-examination where we're always letting go of different parts of our former selves, this is something that you can expect to keep doing over and over and over again as you experience life as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus. Until eventually, you keep doing this until it honestly gets easy for you, or you kind of get a hang of this. And eventually, as we keep letting go of more and more junk, what you'll start to see is that your life is going to look more and more like Jesus's.